Hi and welcome to this video where you'll learn how to use the Dodge and Burn panel in Raya Pro. But before we begin, I just want to say if you're interested in taking your photos to a whole new level, creating stunning landscapes and cityscapes, then by all means check out my art of photography course next to this video, which is by far my most popular course. It'll show you compositional techniques, processing techniques, and shooting techniques. And you'll learn how to photograph a wide range of scenes, including interiors, seascapes, and astro shots. But returning to this video, as with most panels in Raya Pro, we can enable tooltips, and that will allow us to hover our mouse over each function and we can see what that function does. Or if you scroll down this page below the video, you'll see a written description of what every function does as well. But let me demonstrate this visually. So the top functions along here are all dodging and burning functions. Most of these are non-destructive. So these two layers, these two rows are non-destructive ways of dodging and burning. Now if I press highlights, you'll see we've got this levels layer and we've got a black and white mask. Whatever we make white or light gray in the mask is going to be affected by our dodging and burning. So let's say we only wanted to affect the brightest parts of the image. So how about there? I'm bringing the mid-tone slider along and the highlight slider along. Now if I just make that a little bit wider and then press OK, you'll see we have a blank layer with our mask applied. To dodge and burn on here, all we need to do is select the layer, not the mask. Choose a brush by pressing this brush button. And now we can choose white or black. White means we'll be dodging, so making the area brighter, and black will make it darker, so that'll be burning. So with white selected, I can make a big brush by pressing large here, or small makes a smaller brush. And I can make it even bigger by pressing this plus button. You can see we're going up by 250 in our brush size each time. And then I can paint in these areas here. Remember, these are the areas that are selected in the mask. And you see we're just brightening them up a little bit, making them a little bit more impactful. But you'll also notice that when I paint in any other area on this layer, it's not being affected. That's because all of our changes are being constrained to the mask that we created. So there's before and after. You see, we've just brightened up the highlights. Now, what if I decide to start dodging on that layer instead? Well, I can choose a black brush and it won't look very good, but you'll see what I mean. I'm just darkening these areas. You'll see it's not creating any sort of black lines or anything, but it is darkening the highlights. So there's before and after. So we've burned those areas, not dodged them, burned them. Alternatively, we can go to our midtones option here. And now we make a selection of our midtones. And I like to make a nice restricted selection with this. I think that looks okay. And then I can press OK. And again, with a white brush, I'm just going to dodge in these areas. But I'm going to choose a brush of, let's say, around 40%. And you'll see we're brightening up some of those midtones, the midtones that we've selected in our mask. If I paint over the brightest highlights, we're not affecting those too much, but we'll affect the rocks around it. So there's before and after. Now another function within the Dodge and Burn panel is overlay, soft light, and vivid light, and that will change how our dodging and burning is affected. So right now, our layer is set to soft light. If I change it to overlay, we create a more impactful effect, which doesn't necessarily look good. Vivid light is even more extreme. But with overlay, I can always reduce the opacity quite a lot. So if I bring that down to, let's say, 30%, you see we've brought some life into those areas. And of course, with shadows, it's exactly the same. We're selecting only the shadows. Here, that means most of the image because the image is quite dark. But I can change that mask so we affect only the darkest parts of the image. Then with a white brush, because I want to brighten those up, I can paint in those areas. And you see we are brightening up the shadows. And I can change my brush opacity to 100%. And there you can see it's much stronger. And if I paint in the brightest areas, it doesn't make any difference because we're constrained by the mask. So if I bring the opacity down that layer, there you go. Just before and after. We've softened the shadows but brought some more detail into the midtones. Now merge is the same merge function you find in the hub. It essentially and non-destructively merges all of our layers into one new layer. 50% gray is exactly the same as the functions I've just shown you with shadows, midtones, highlights, but it isn't constrained by any masks. So we can basically choose a brush, white brush or a black brush, and just paint over a certain area and reduce the opacity. It's not as effective as using these buttons up here, but it is still effective. Curves is a curves layer that we can paint in. So basically it's a contrast adjustment layer. And you see it's really strong, but we can manually paint that in wherever we want. And if we find the color in this layer is too strong, we can change the blend mode of it to luminosity. And that's a little bit better. And of course, we can always reduce the opacity. Now for dodge, burn and sponge, well, this is your standard dodging and burning functionality. So you can press merge, press dodge, and you see we've got the dodge tool selected. Or we can press burn, and then there's the burn tool and the sponge. So if we can select dodge, we can then brighten up the shadows because that's what I've got selected. So that's a destructive way of dodging and burning. And by the way, we're not restricted to white and black colors. We can go to my image here of Glenorchy, and let's say I want to add more warmth to the highlights. I can click highlights here, and I can make a really strong selection of the highlights and then press OK. And before, we chose a white brush. So if we paint in there, you'll see we are dodging the highlights. But we can change the color of our brush by selecting these colors here, or by pressing the eyedropper. And then we can select any part of the image. But essentially, I'm going to select this beige color here, and I'm just going to paint on the image all the way across. And you see, we've now added color, a beige color, to the highlights. There's before and after. Or I can add some pinks to the sky because it's already a pink sky. But I think that's a little bit strong. And here is a darker beige. So there we go. I think that looks a little bit better. And just as before, we reduce the opacity of that layer. And you see we've added more color in the highlights of that sky. So we're not limited to black and white when it comes to dodging and burning in this panel. Now going back to my Antelope Canyon image, underneath this section we have a bottom section here which has different functionality. So we can enhance details here. We can enhance details in the shadows, details in the brighter parts of our scene. But if I go just here for detail, shadows, and then I press OK if I'm happy with how many details are there. And there's the mask, so I can restrict it, make it just targeted to the darkest shadows and some of the midtones. Then I can do before and after. So we've enhanced local contrast, but we've done so only in the darker tones. You see there's before and after. And exactly the same functionality exists for the detail lights, but it affects only the highlights, which we don't really have many in this image. Now with glow free, essentially, let me go back to the Glenorchy image. If we press glow free, now we have a new layer which isn't restricted by any mask. And I can, let's say I want to brighten up this area where there's a light. So I can make a bigger brush, and let's say a brush opacity of around 40%. And I'm going to choose a white brush, and I can click once here. And you see we brightened that area slightly. If you didn't see that, let me undo it and just increase the brush opacity to 100%. Now that's before and after. You see we brightened that area. We can also take the black brush and sweep around the outside. So we're making a kind of vignette. So look at this, before and after. We're shifting the whole mood of the image with that one non-destructive layer. We're pointing the viewer's eyes towards the light there. Now zone contrast is going to create contrast in using curves layers, but also with luminosity masks. So we've got two midtones layers, two shadow layers, and two highlights layers. And each one has a mask applied. So there's the highlights layer, highlight 2, highlight 1, shadows 1, shadows 2. And essentially what that means is we can open one up and make very targeted adjustments to specific tones in our image. So that's just affecting our shadows. So we've just brightened up our shadows there, you see? And of course we can always reduce opacity if the effect's too strong. An S-curve is a standard S-curve using a curves layer just to add a lot of contrast. Dark sky will darken the brightest parts of our image. Just like that. You see the brightest parts, including the light, darken nicely and we'll often get a richer color. Bright highlights will make our highlights brighter. Protect shadows will make sure that we have no clipped areas in our shadows. You see, it just makes it a little bit softer. Lighten shadows will have a stronger effect. That'll brighten all the darker tones in your image. Let me delete that layer and I'll delete these other ones. And then I can use fake HDR and that will bring down our highlights and soften our shadows at the same time. So we come out with a softer scene with less contrast. Autumn effects give us a more magical feel to our scene, a soft kind of surreal feel. So if we press the standard autumn effect and just press OK, there we have that levels layer, which allows us to brighten our autumn effect layer. Now that's before and that's after. You see, it's really soft. Now I recommend just keeping this layer to a maximum of 10%. Now I don't think it's necessary here in this photo, but there are other autumn effects too. So if you want a brighter autumn effect, you can press autumn effect bright and it has a slightly different effect. Or we can have autumn effect warm, so our scene will have an autumn effect but also have extra warmth added to it, just like that. Of course, we can bring down the opacity of that layer. And we can have the opposite, so we can have an autumn effect cold instead. And that will make the scene quite cool. And it generally is quite strong, so we need to bring that opacity all the way down. And that's it for the functionality in the Dodge and Burn panel in Raya Pro. I hope you found it useful. Thank you very much for watching and I'll see you next time.